to this evening, Mr. Ben Ruskin. The stage is...
I'll go on one slide to my About Me slide.
Oh, so I send your slide. Yeah,
so there you go. Yeah.
Now you're on.
Yes. So I'm Ben. My background is in vegetable production. So I was a commercial organic vegetable grower for around 12 years. And then for the last 18 years or so, I have been working mostly for the Soil Association, which is an organic food and farming charity and certifying body in the UK. I've worked part-time for most of that 18 years, so I've done other projects on the side, partly growing projects, so I like to keep doing some practical growing, but also some independent consultancy and some writing. So there's my little selection of books there that I've written. So the main thing, apart from the Soil Association and the writing that I'm doing at the moment, is working at Helen Browning's farm. So Helen Browning, as some of you may know, is the chief executive of the Soil Association, but she also has a 800-hectare farm near Swindon, near where I live, and I manage the tree planting and the agroforestry on her farm. So that's the integration of the trees into her farming system. So that's a bit about me. So on to woodchip, my passion. So I thought I'd start with perhaps a fairly obvious question. Where does woodchip come from? Wood, obviously, but it's a relatively recent product in a sense. The first wood chipper was invented in 1884 by a man called Peter Jensen in Germany, and he invented it because he worked in the parks department, and all of these public municipal parks had lots of trees and bushes that they were pruning, and they didn't really know what to do with them, and it seemed a shame to be burning them. So he invented a machine to chip them up and to use it. So effectively any part of a tree can be chipped or broken up, and it really, even without any machinery, when I'm pruning the shrubs in my garden, I just use a pair of secateurs and cut up the branches really small, and that is still wood chip and can be used as a mulch. Obviously, when you start to get the scale that you can see in this photo with my delightful children climbing all over it, you need something a bit bigger, and there's various different types of machine that you can use, from very small, what are called shredders sometimes. And again, there's two types of machine. There's machines that rip it, and there's machines that chop it, and they produce a slightly different material. Those very small home shredders, which some of you may have, are quite useful for some of the very small bits you'll have, but anything you get a bit more than 2 or 3 centimeters, it gets tricky, and then you're looking at bigger machinery that for most home gardeners and allotmenters is not really affordable or worthwhile. So then there's a question about how you get the wood chip, and we'll come on to that. So I first started getting into wood chip, I guess I'd used it for quite a long time, and I'm imagining that most of you will have, even if you haven't used it yourself, are aware of the fact that you can use it as a mulch, and particularly a mulch on paths. It's really useful. It keeps your feet dry, it keeps the weeds down, stops everything getting muddy, and it's very well used as that. Over the last 5-10 years, I've started to understand a much wider range of ways in which we can use wood chip, which is what I'm going to try and enthuse you about tonight. But we are still going to start on mulches, because mulches is probably the easiest and the most straightforward way of using wood chip. And I'm going to talk about it under a few categories. So we're going to look at weeds, water, temperature modulation, preventing splash, and pest and disease control. So wood chip can help with all of these. So if we start with weed control, there's 3 ways that wood chip can help. Firstly, obviously, it cuts out light. So you have a layer of wood chip on top of the soil, and that stops light getting through to the plants. and also any seeds that are trapped underneath won't germinate, mostly if they haven't got light. So my experience and the research that I've done suggests that you need a minimum of 15 centimeters deep to work as a weed control mulch. I'm now going thicker than that on most things. I'm now looking at, particularly with tree planting and shrubs, I'm looking at 25 centimeters deep as a mulch. And it lasts longer. You have to do it less often, but it does use quite a lot of material. There's other ways, though, that it can help with weed control. There are chemicals, particularly in fresh wood chip, that have an allopathic effect. So that's a chemical effect that inhibits the growth or the germination of seeds and weeds. So if you imagine a fresh cedar chip, for instance, and that wonderful smell you get from cut conifers, well, those volatile chemicals will actually stop plants seeds germinating. So it's really good when it's fresh as a way of stopping weeds germinating on top. Obviously, once it starts to decompose and turns more into compost, then it becomes more like a seed bed and is actually quite attractive to those annual seeds. So there's a time window there. And then the other way, particularly again with fresh wood chip, is if you've got big lumps of wood, then they're dry and they're hard. So if a weed seed lands on it, it's just not going to germinate because it's dry and it's not a nice place to grow. So you've got a good 6 months to a year of that physical prevention as well. It's worth saying, though, that wood chip is not good at controlling perennial weeds. So what happens with perennial weeds is you smother them with wood chip, and then mostly they've got lots of vigor in the roots and they push their way up through, like you can see with these thistles here. And then, of course, because you've smothered everything else, there's no competition for those perennial weeds. So they're growing quite happily with no competition, and they get quite quickly out of control. So this is an example at the farm where I work, where we mulched a big row of trees that we planted, and quite quickly you can see the thistles came out, and then it didn't take long before it turned into that. Which in this situation is fine. It's where we graze cows. It's not causing particular problems, but you wouldn't want that in your allotment. I imagine your neighbours would be quite cross with you, I suspect. So yeah.
Sorry, we have a question, and we decided to take the questions as they come.
Yeah.
And we have this person writing, we have a medium semi-professional wood chipper and will this spring chop up birch branches from our farm outside Varberg in Halland. Can you use the whole branch, even the smallest twigs, for the purposes you mentioned?
You absolutely can, and I will come on to the distinction between the smaller branches and the bigger branches, but no, you can definitely use everything. The only thing is that the smaller branches will decompose more quickly. So they've got more, they're softer, they've got more nitrogen and other nutrients in them. So all the organisms that are in your soil and in the air that will break wood down, they'll break those smaller bits down more quickly. And that can be an advantage in some situations. But for a mulch, it means that you don't get such a long period of control. But that doesn't mean that you can't use them. It just means you might have to put them on more often. So yeah, absolutely. And there's a term which I'll come on to. There's a term called ramial wood chip, which is RAMIAL. And that's the term used to describe wood chip from branches that's less than 7 centimeters in diameter. So again, it's all of those small branches, hedge clippings, that sort of thing. But no, really useful material, but just slightly different properties to some of that big old chip. That's much more carbony. Right. Was that the only question for now?
That was all.
Yeah, great. That's fine. I'll crack on.
Yes.
So the other way that a wood chip mulch can work is in retaining water, and typically it will hold in about 25% more water in a soil if you've got a good mulch, or conversely reduce your watering needs by about 25%. And this picture that you can see here was one of my major sort of inspirations for writing the book. So this is where we've planted a lot of trees on the farm. This was in 2017, 2018. So I don't know about in Sweden, but in the UK in 2018, we had a very hot, long, dry spring. It was quite severe drought quite soon after we planted all of these trees. These trees that you can look at now were all planted on the same day, and the ones in the foreground are mostly the same species, so they're willow. The difference is the ones on the right had an accidental mulch of about 75 centimeters deep, which is not what I'd recommend as a depth. But we dumped them, basically we dumped the mulch over the hedge, and I was supposed to be moving it all and mulching all the trees, and I never got around to it. So the trees on the right had this really heavy mulch. And as you can see, the difference in growth is extraordinary. And this picture was taken about 4 years ago, or 3 years ago. The trees on the right are now, well, certainly 4.5 meters, 5 meters tall, and the ones on the left are not much taller than me still. So that difference just really made me appreciate how much difference a mulch can make. And I think it was particularly because it's willow, which likes water, and particularly because it was a very hot, dry year. So I don't think you would always see this difference, but it's quite impressive nonetheless. There's potentially also an effect, and this might have had something to do with that previous slide, where a mulch, any mulch really, but wood chip or compost mulch will keep your soil cooler in the summer, and it will keep it warmer in the winter. And typically most plants, and actually most soil organisms, don't like those real extremes of temperature. So most soil organisms are active at around 25 degrees centigrade. Fungi can cope a bit better with colder conditions. Bacteria can cope a bit better with hotter conditions. But overall, they like it in that sort of 20, 25, 30 degree middle bit. And so the more you can stop them getting to those extremes, the better. And a really good mulch in winter, for instance, can keep the soil 10 degrees warmer. And then in really hot weather, particularly, it slows down how quickly it heats up as the sun rises. So you can really sort of build some resilience into your soil in terms of temperature. This one is not necessarily applicable to everything, but as you're probably aware, if you get really heavy rain on bare soil, the big water droplets will cause mud to splash up and splash onto the leaves, the underleaves of plants, and that creates this environment around those lower leaves that are really attractive to fungal diseases. So ideally you want to keep the bottom of those plants dry, and a wood chip mulch will do that. There was a trial in America looking at box plants, which get this disease called box blight, which can devastate the whole box hedges. They did a trial doing them with mulches and without, and the wood chip mulch reduced the disease by 97%, so almost eliminated it. And they think there were two reasons for that. One is that the splash didn't happen, and the other is that they mulched after leaf drop in autumn. So some of the leaves dropped in autumn. It's evergreen, so they don't all drop, but some of them did, and they mulched on top of those leaves, so effectively stopping any water that fell didn't hit the infected leaves to splash back up. So even if there was some splash, it wasn't diseased. So brassicas, for instance, sometimes suffer from that, and lettuces can as well, you know, where you get splash onto the undersides of lettuces. So there's quite a few plants that could benefit from that. And it's a bonus really, because you're still getting all the weed control and the water retention benefits that we've talked about.
Yes, me again.
Oh yeah,
the question,
excellent. Yeah, excellent.
And it's a question about planting trees. Do you still plant the trees in the soil on the same level as normal, and then 25 centimeters mulch on top? Does fruit trees like apple really like to be that deep down?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So what I would tend to do is we create a donut mulch, it's called. So it's like a ring of mulch. So ideally, wood chip is not touching the bark of the tree. So you're absolutely right. They don't want to be under the level. But the other way you can do it, and on heavier soils, we've done this a bit sometimes, is actually creating a mound and planting the tree into the mound and then mulching around. So that's another way of doing it. But yes, for most trees, you definitely, if you have the mulch touching the bark, it can cause, again, this damp, wet area that can bring in disease. So ideally, yeah, this donut mulch, as we call it, yeah.
Yeah, right. And we have another one that asks about the same, no problem with covering the stem with 25 centimeters of mulch, but you already answered that one.
Well, I did, although I would say that because it's willow, it doesn't matter. I think if I'd had 75 centimeters mulch on an apple tree, it would have been a disaster. But willow, you know, my old horticultural teacher used to tell me that willow would root in my pocket. And that'll root in your pocket, that will, because basically it roots anywhere. So you can pile it up around willow. So yes, I think it was an unusual case in being willow and wood chip. So, but yeah, no, good question.
Okay, yeah, and willow, I wrote it. It's sälj in Swedish, so they like wet.
Yes, exactly.
And what is the second method? A mound. Could you repeat that?
So yeah, so for trees or plants that don't like being in wet ground over winter, then there's a method where you create effectively a mound, maybe 30 centimeters high of soil, and then you plant the tree into that mound. So if the soil gets wet, they've still got, say, 30 centimeters of soil that keeps drier. So that's a way of growing on wetter land, or, you know, trees like cherries, for instance, that don't like to be wet. So we haven't done that much of it, but I know some people do that a lot. But it gets a bit tricky to then mulch as well, because you end up getting higher and higher. But you can combine the two. Does that make sense?
We'll see if there will be more questions.
Let me know if I need to get back to it. Okay, so this is a small aside in a way. So one of the problems we get with planting trees, and particularly planting trees into grassland, which is a lot of what we do, is we get voles. So these little creatures here that look all very innocent, they're eating their worm, but they can cause a lot of damage and eat a lot of tree roots. And one of the ways that people normally control weeds in plantations and woodlands is using a mulch mat, so like a square of plastic or of hessian. What we've found is if you use that, you're creating this lovely little house for the vole, and the house lives underneath, and the vole lives underneath there, and he's going, thank you very much, I'm nice and dry and protected, and the owls can't eat me. So we saw quite a lot of damage when we used those mats. Where we put the wood chip directly onto the soil, we didn't get any vole damage. Still lots of voles, but no vole damage. And I think it's because the bits of wood chip were falling into their runs and they didn't like it, and the area around the tree was bare, so the birds of prey could come in and eat them. So where you've got this sort of protective layer of something, and people where they've used things like sheep's wool as well, which you can use for mulching, but again, it creates this lovely little home for things like voles. But yeah.
Well, we have time for 2 more questions, and then I'll let you go on for a while.
Okay.
We had one in Swedish. I will translate. When I have put out mulch, I've had wizard rings in my lawn. Do you say that in English? Häxringar.
I think we call them fairy rings. So we're talking about circles of fungus. Is that what?
Yes, right.
Yeah. We call them fairy rings. Yeah.
That's much nicer. Well, is that has that something to do with the mulch, or doesn't matter?
So typically, and we'll come on to this, but typically if you add wood chip and woody material to your soil, you are creating an environment that is more suited to fungus, to mushrooms and
Yes.
to fungus. So that mostly is a good thing because you want diversity and you want lots of fungi in there. But occasionally there will be ones that you don't want in there, which sounds like this is the case. If if you're using it near a lawn and then you get the fungus in the lawn to create the fairy rings, that can be a problem. But mostly I would say it's a good thing to encourage wider ranges of fungi in your soil. But occasionally it might cause problems.
Right. So let's go on now for a while.
Okay.
That would be many questions.
No, that's fine. Interrupt me. It's good to interrupt because it stops people having to listen to me constantly. So, there's a couple of other things that came up with disease control. So we run a program at the Soil Association called the Innovative Farmers Program. And what we do is we bring together groups of farmers with scientists and researchers. And the reason for doing this typically is that lots of farmers have really good ideas about how they might be able to improve their system or try new things. So they're always full of good ideas. They're not very good typically at running a trial that tells them whether their idea is any good. So they do a trial and at the end of the year they go, I don't know if that really worked or not, because they haven't put in replications or they haven't collected the information properly. And at the other end of the scale, you get lots of scientists getting lots of money to do really great science about something that has no relevance on the ground. So they get to the end of their project, they go, look what we found out, and we go, yeah, I didn't need to know that, thank you. So what we hope by bringing these two groups of people together is that we get the expertise of running trials and the ideas and practicality of the farmers, and you get better results, and your farmers are more likely to then act on the result as well if they've been part of a group that's trialing it. Anyway, we ran one of these on looking at cider orchards, so alcoholic apple juice. I don't know if you call it cider in Sweden, but alcoholic drink made from apples. And there was some suggestion that using willow wood chip. So willow has got this salicylic acid in, so what aspirin is made of, and there's some evidence that can stimulate an immune reaction in trees. So we wanted to trial this in a commercial setting. So we spread willow wood chip around these cider trees and then measured how much scab disease. So scab is a fungal disease on apples that can be very damaging. So the trial was not conclusive, but it did show a tendency towards controlling it. And there's actually no reason in some sense why that wood chip wouldn't have a similar effect against a lot of diseases. So one of the things I'm really interested in, and there's not much research, but is whether these single species wood chips, so things like willow or oak or cedar, there's obviously thousands of them, but whether they've got particular properties that we might be able to then harness and use. So lots of potential for research, but not much has been done yet. So that's mulches. Any other questions on mulches before we move on, or we're all good?
Yeah, we have some. So let's see. Will you? Well, that's a question for you, but we're talking more about pine and spruce bark. How it's different to use from other wood chop. Will that come later?
No, we can cover that now.
Yeah.
So it depends what you're going to use it for. If you're using it for a mulch, particularly a mulch around trees or shrubs, I would say it doesn't really matter what you use. It will break down relatively quickly. It won't have any discernible negative effect on your soil. So there's fear about changing pH or things like that, robbing nitrogen. I'll cover maybe the nitrogen bit separately because it's something that always comes up. But typically, if you're using it as a mulch, it will break down. Any risky chemicals in cedar, for instance, they break down in 3-4 months, so there won't be any damage to soil. If you're using it so we'll come on later to using it, for instance, to make your own seed and plant potting composts. So if you're using it for that, then you don't want too much of the conifers in there. Typically 25%, 30% maximum within a mix. and using the deciduous ones as the base. So yeah, so it can make a difference, but it depends what you're using it for.
Okay, so we go on. Lena asks, I wonder if I need extra fertilizer so the wood chips don't take nutrition from soil. That was
Excellent.
About the same.
So that's my nitrogen point. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, it's the big myth about wood chip is that you can't put it on soil because nothing will grow because it will steal all the nitrogen. And while it is a myth, there is some truth in it, and you can cause problems. But what I've realized is that those problems are mostly over exaggerated. So what happens effectively is if you've got wood, bacteria can't break the wood down because bacteria need lots of nitrogen. So typically it's fungi that break wood down, certainly initially. Then once it's partly digested, then the other things come in. Fungi don't need anything like as much nitrogen to function and to grow as bacteria. They can manage on quite low levels of nitrogen. And there's some nitrogen comes down in the rain, and there will be a bit of nitrogen in the soil anyway, potentially. But if they haven't got enough, what they do is they go out looking for it. So they'll send out little hyphae to go and search for some nitrogen. But what seems to happen is that they only get as far as about a centimetre from where the wood is. So if you put it on the surface of the soil, you will typically lose nitrogen from that top centimetre, which for most things is not a problem. If you're using it on very shallow rooted plants, then it can be a problem. So I don't put it on, for instance, raspberries, because raspberries, they're rooting just under the surface. I did put it on raspberries once and I had a lot of problems and they didn't grow very well. So I wouldn't, or very young seedlings. If you put fresh wood chip on very young seedlings, it will cause you problems. The other thing not to do is to dig the wood chip in. So if you imagine it's sitting on the top, it's fine, it's not causing any problems. If you then dig that wood chip into the soil, every bit of wood chip is then scavenging for nitrogen around it. And so that's when you cause a lot of problems. And the worst you can do is use fresh sawdust. So, like the very fine dust that comes out of sawmills and woodworking, because that's got a massive surface area. So if you dig that into your soil, that will cause you real problems. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use wood chip in those situations. It just means that you need to compost it first. Or potentially, which I think was the question, potentially you can add, say, compost or manure or something with a higher nitrogen level in it. So even a liquid feed potentially. But actually, if you just leave it for 12 months, it will start composting on its own, and then it becomes nitrogen neutral, as it were. So,
and you already answered one of the next question about composting it, so we already answered that.
Yeah.
But I have another one. Is it possible to, Karen Lewis asks, is it possible to shred very thick and thorny rose bushes after pruning with extremely sharp thorns? I have tried to burn them instead of, or throw them away. They seem to be completely uncompostable and even indestructible. Very annoying.
They will break down eventually. But yes, some things take longer than others. I haven't looked specifically at rose thorns, I confess, but they will break. They're organic material. They will break down. It might take 12 months. It might take 2 years. I don't know. And I guess the problem is that they're potentially quite painful in the meantime if they're not broken down. So time, I would imagine, is your friend in that instance.
Always.
But again, adding nitrogen into that mix will speed up the how much it decomposes. But if you put rose clippings through a chipper, it probably mostly won't chip the thorn, it will chip the wood. But the other thing that happens, if you imagine you've got a bit of stem, the fungi gets in from each end. it finds it very hard to break through the bark. So the smaller your wood chips are, the quicker it will decompose, because it's getting right in and decomposing. You know, if you imagine you lay a big log on the soil, it takes quite a long time for that to break down, because the fungi's got to get all the way in through the edge or wait for the bark to break down. So the smaller you can chip it, the quicker it will break down. So that's one way. And I guess the other way, I mean, again, it depends on the scale of which you're doing it. But if you've only got a very small number of your rose things, you could almost take a sledgehammer to it and just beat it and sort of bruise it, and because you'll be breaking down that bark and creating entry points for the fungus. But yeah, if you've got a lot of them, that would be not a pleasant job.
Wonderful answers anyway, because those myths are like generally all over the place, that you couldn't and I think, use the mulch because of the nitrogen loss. But this was not interesting.
And I think that's why people haven't used it as much until recently, because they've been afraid of, you know, and you can, as I say, you can cause problems, but generally I would say with a bit of care, you'll be all right.
Actually, we are striving in the Allotment Federation to learn that you should not have anything leave your garden. You should keep every material in your garden, because those are your resources.
Exactly.
So this is very good news.
Yeah. So let's move on to worms.
Yeah.
So one of the other thing you might read or come across if you're looking at wood chip is people go, don't put wood chip in your worm bin. They don't like wood chip. And you can see from this photo. So this, when at the farm where I work, we get wood chip delivered from tree surgeons, from arborists. And we get it delivered onto a concrete pad. So this wood chip has been sitting on concrete, not on the soil. And you can see that it's not very broken down at all. There's still quite big lumps there. And already the worms are coming in. I was surprised how quickly worms came in and started living in it, even when I thought it didn't look very attractive to them. And there's lots of evidence that adding woody material to your soil builds worm populations. There's even one dating back to 1950 that showed a 3-fold increase in worm populations when you added wood chips. So there's, you know, we know that it does good to soil through worms, and also, as I've already mentioned, through fungi. So a lot of our soils are typically now more bacterially focused than fungi. So I don't know, some of you I'm sure will have come across this concept of the shift as soils get older from a very bacteria-dominated soil to a fungal-dominated soil. So typically in a very new soil, so it might be a volcano erupts or a glacier comes down and brings a whole load of new rock down, and you end up with effectively rock. And the only thing that can live on rock are things like lichens and bacteria. So they inhabit that to start with. And then as they die and break down and destroy the rock a little bit, they start to form a tiny bit of soil. And then these more complex things come in. Fungi comes in a little bit much later on. And then when you get, you know, bigger plants come in and germinate, and then shrubs and then trees, and eventually you get the sort of the ultimate, which is the forest or the woodland. And at that point, it's much more fungally dominated. Every time we dig our soil, or every time we spray a fungicide on our soil, which I'm sure none of you ever do, you're killing fungi effectively. Fungi don't like being disturbed. They don't like chemicals. And so gradually over time, a lot of us have inadvertently been destroying fungi in our soils. And they've become more bacterially dominated, because bacteria can cope with that change better. And one of the things we do with wood chip is we start to reshift that balance, and we start to sort of get back towards a bit more fungal content. And a lot of the plants that we grow in gardens, particularly shrubs and trees, they like a fungal dominant or more fungally dominated soil. So for a lot of our plants, it's much better to do that. Any questions?
Yes, all the time.
So let's have a couple more questions, and then I'll move on to composting.
pine mulch, is that okay for raspberries? But you just said raspberries, you should perhaps avoid thick layers.
So yes, avoid thick layers, definitely. Yeah. Pine is slightly acidic. So you will get potentially a very short-term acidic effect, but it won't shift it significantly. So yes, a thin mulch would be fine, I think, but definitely not a thick mulch.
Okay.
And I actually learned after doing my thick mulch on raspberries that actually raspberries don't even like thick mulches of something composted even. So yes, keep it thin on raspberries.
All right. Another, I tried chipping rose clippings and I can confirm that the chip will be thorny. It will also find your toes anytime you are barefoot.
So definitely not one for barefoot gardeners.
Note to self. Is there anything you recommend not to use for chips mulch?
Mostly not. Again, it does depend a little bit on the situation. So one of the things that I talk about in the book, which is potentially less relevant on allotments, but is using it as a bedding material for livestock. And then you have to be careful about some poisonous species, and again about thorns, so things like blackthorn and hawthorn, which can be quite damaging. But mostly it's fine, and if you're worried, you just compost it for a bit longer, and then it will definitely be fine. So again, your point, Ingrid, in a way that you want to keep everything that's coming out of the garden and from other people's gardens. There is one other point, I can't remember if I've got a slide in it, but one of the things I was a little bit nervous about when I started using a lot of wood chip was introducing disease into the farm or my garden. And I think you still have to be a bit careful, but I have become a little less concerned. And I think there's a few reasons. One is often disease attacks old, weak plants. So if you're, particularly if you're mulching new trees or new plants, I think the risk of them being affected by the mulch is pretty low. We do stack and compost our wood chip a little bit, so that will already start to break down disease and reduce the amount in. And then also for a lot of diseases, the spores are everywhere. They're in the air. They're not particularly brought in on the wood chip. So you're not necessarily increasing significantly your risk. And because you're boosting generally the soil health and the health of your plants, your plants should then be better able to fight off some of these diseases anyway. But that's not to say that there's no risk. And I think being aware of that, and particularly if you're using wood chip from tree surgeons and arborists, where they might well be cutting that tree down because it's diseased. If you're then putting it on a tree that's a similar species or that is affected by it, there are definitely some fungal diseases like honey fungus, for instance, that you don't really want to be introducing. So I would say there's not that there's no risk, but I'm mostly now quite relaxed about that risk in a lot of situations. So.
Yeah, and that's another point, to just be self-sufficient and not to transport away your own material.
Yeah, the more you can create your holistic system, the better, for sure.
Yeah. So go on, and I take a few questions later on.
So composting wood chip. There's a farmer here called Ian Tolhurst, who, if you're ever looking for another speaker, I would highly recommend. He's a guru. He's one of the most talented growers
What's his name again?
Ian Tolhurst.
Ian Tolhurst. Yeah. I write it down.
Yeah, he's just actually recently been awarded a MBE for his services to horticulture. He's an impressive chap. But anyway, this is his farm, and he was one of the people that inspired me about wood chip. So he does use some of his own material, but he also gets wood chip delivered from local tree surgeons. And as you can see, what he does is he lines it up in a row, and then he turns it twice, usually during the year. So he'll move it on this picture. He'll move it from the left over to the right. You can see that sort of new the old pile at the other end where it's already been turned and he's using it. And he'll leave it there for 12 months usually. So it's a 12-month process with 2 turnings. And then after that, he spreads it on his field as a soil improver. He keeps a small amount of it, which he then composts for another 6 months. And he uses that in his propagation compost, which I'll come on to. So wood chip will break down effectively. And actually, it breaks down better in cooler, wetter climates than in hot, dry climates. So the UK, we're fine. Sweden, you're probably all right. Fungi likes it, likes it cooler, and it likes it damp. It stops working in the summer. So Ian Toll basically noticed that his wood chip compost heap stopped decomposing during the summer, and he tried watering it and irrigating it, and it didn't make any difference. So you just have to wait for the cooler weather to come in again. But it will do it on its own, even without any other additions. So on an allotment, if you've got an area on your allotment site where you can just leave it and almost have a 2-year cycle where you get it delivered 1 year, use it the following year, that works really well. Or on your individual allotments or gardens, you can put it in a big sack and just leave it in the sack for 12 months and it will break down and become usable. So it's really easy. You can turn it, but you don't have to turn it. And again, you can add in green material or you can add in compost. So you can see here that he's added in a little bit of his grass clippings and a bit of waste from his pack house that he grows for a box scheme. But it's not significant. It's at most 5%. Most of it is wood chip, but you can add some of that other stuff in. And if you've got a good composting system, you can add wood chip into that composting system, and it's really beneficial. As looking at it the other way around. So broadly speaking, my advice would be to just leave it. But if you want to turn it or you want to incorporate other compost in, then do. There's also ways of doing it. I don't know if you've come across the Johnson-Su bioreactor method. There are other ones available, but this is a couple in the States that have been developing what's called static or aerated composting systems. So one of the problems that you get in the composting system, you can quite often get these little bits of it that are compacted, or they get too dry, or they get too wet, and so you end up, bits of the heap don't always compost well, and that's generally why we turn compost heaps, is around sort of controlling temperature and making sure all the different bits of the heap compost properly. In this system, what you do, I don't know how clearly you can see that photo, but there's a series of plastic tubes. You pack all the wood chip in around those tubes, and then you pull the plastic tubes out, but you've ended up with a whole series of air ducts in that wood chip. So there's air getting to every bit of the compost heap. So you get much more even composting. And the other bit that they've discovered is that the diversity of fungi and other microorganisms in their composting system is much wider. It's like 4 times as many species as you get within a turned one. Now, what the actual benefit of that, who knows? But as a general rule, diversity is a good thing. So this, again, there's lots of videos you can look at. If you just Google Johnson-Su bioreactor, there's how-to videos, and it's really interesting. This particular one was a farmer that was doing it on the back of a trailer, but you can do much smaller systems. And there are some people that are building them on pallets and then pumping air up underneath, so you can control temperature by increasing airflow underneath if you want to get very geeky about it. But yeah, so that's composting. Any questions on composting?
Yeah, well, we have a bit of everything. I would like to take this question, which is very, very Swedish. And now I put in a small picture of you also in the emission as a change, as you will answer this. How are snails affected by mulch? And the snail is the main thing.
Yes. So slugs and snails are obviously a massive, well, yeah, both a major problem here as well. Some people say that wood chip makes it worse. Other people say it helps. But I don't know is the short answer. I think it can create areas where it favors slugs, and it can create areas where they like to lay their eggs. But equally, it can also build soil health to the point where there's more predators for slug eggs, and it can reduce it. So if I'm honest, I don't think it will make a big difference either way. But I'm certainly not going to pretend it will help.
Okay.
If that answers the question.
Yeah. Mona asks, I've heard that soil dominant in bacteria is beneficial for perennial weeds. Does wood chip have long-term positive effect on perennial weed through making the soil fungal dominant? Is that the reason?
Oh, good question. And I don't know is the short answer. That would be really interesting to look at. Yeah, I don't know. One of the things that Ian Tolhurst has also started doing is he said to me recently, he said, I've spent, because he's been growing for 50 years or something, he said, I've spent 50 years waging war on weeds, and he said, now I've given up. I'm going to let them win, he said, but I'm going to encourage diversity of weeds. So he lets a whole range of weeds seed, because he said, as long as one isn't getting out of hand, I can cope with it. So what you typically find in any year is that the conditions of that year suit a particular weed. So one year thistle will just be terrible, and the next year it might be chickweed, so the different weeds will favor a certain set of conditions. So his view is you allow them all to reach some kind of balance rather than trying to eliminate all of them and leave the ground bare for that particular one to come in a particular year. But yeah, I have no idea whether wood chip would long-term help with perennial weeds or not. Yeah, don't know. Interesting question though.
Okay, so let's go on a bit and say.
Okay, so oh yeah, so this is the final bit of the propagation compost. So this is that same compost heap from the other end, and the bit that you can see under the plastic here, so he covers it for the final. Normally he doesn't cover it because partly because weeds tend not to grow on the wood chip, and partly because he wants the rain to come in. It needs to be moist for the fungi to work. So he generally doesn't cover while it's composting, but for the last 6 months he does, because he doesn't want lots of weed seed in his propagation compost. So that's why it's covered. And then the pictures at the bottom left is strawberries that he's propagated, and you can see looking really healthy and green. The ones on the right are actually at another farm where who we're about to see in the next slide, a grower called Fred. He grows plant where he has the wood chip dumped in rows again, but he then grows plants in it while it's composting. So he grows ochre and squashes and things in it. So he's making use of it as an area for growing even while it's waiting. So I mentioned earlier the Innovative Farmers Programme. We did another one of those, what we call field labs, the trials with Ian Tolhurst, looking at making a propagation, so a seed compost from wood chip. So this is using the method I've described. He then sieves the material from under that plastic. He sieves so that he gets all the big lumps out. They just go back into next year's heap. And then he adds, we added a bit of biochar for the trial, but I think he does also use perlite and vermiculite, which he's trying to find a way around because it can be a bit dense. And we trialed that material against a leading heat-based commercial compost, and there was almost no difference in germination and growth between the two, which was quite remarkable. And actually, when we planted it in the field, the leeks that had been grown in the wood chip or with biochar actually had less disease than the ones that had been grown in peat. So we've proved that you can replace peat compost with homemade wood chip compost, basically. Now, whether it would work on every crop, I don't know. But I would definitely encourage you to experiment with some of this stuff. And he had really good germination, really good growth, and it feels like a real opportunity. And again, I think when we were talking, Ingrid, in preparation for this, you mentioned that there's a new initiative in Sweden about cutting peat use in half, and
Right.
we've been, organisations like the Soil Association have been campaigning about this in the UK for decades, and we're finally getting somewhere now. But there is still a challenge of where that material is going to come from, and how do you move away from it in a way that gives people confidence. So some of the peat-free material, products in the UK are really bad, just really bad material, and so gardener is going to go, oh, I need to use peat-free, I've got to stop using peat, and they buy this thing and nothing germinates and grows, and they go, oh god, well I'll go back to peat. So we've got to make sure that there's good materials. But going back to that holistic, using your own materials, the more you can be in control of what you're doing and not relying on something else, the better.
Yeah, and I will say a few words about that campaign in the end. So thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah. Great. So now this is quite interesting. So this is Fred Bonistru, who's a Dutch grower near me, amazing biodynamic grower, and he creates his own hotbeds for his propagation. So hopefully you can see, basically it's 2 pallets long, 1 pallet wide. He piles in fresh wood chip, ideally this ramial wood chip that we talked about. So that's the wood chip from the smaller branches, because you need some nitrogen in that to get the composting started quickly for this particular way. He piles it all on, and then he puts the perspex sheet on the top. So originally he put his seedlings directly on the wood chip, but it was too hot and he ended up killing them. So he now puts the perspex just as a bit of insulation, and he gets 6 weeks to 8 weeks of temperature warm enough to germinate and grow peppers and tomatoes. So historically people have used manure for this. Some of the old country houses in the UK used to grow pineapples 200 years ago using this method. But what Fred has found is that wood chip gives a longer lasting, more even heat. So with manure, you get it getting very hot quite quickly and then dropping down and getting cold. Whereas with the wood chip, it lasts for longer and is more even. And then obviously at the end of that, he just empties it and spreads it onto the soil because it's partly composted. So it's a really good little system, and because he doesn't have electricity where he's growing. So yeah, really nice way of harnessing the heat from that composting. Any more questions, or shall I crack on?
Yeah. Yes. Let's see. This is a different 3-part question. So in other words, it would be best for our association to make a big pile and let it stand for 12 months and turn it twice before use, or gather wood chips in black garbage bags and let them stand for a year and mix other types of mulch with the contents. Can bio-coal be mixed with the wood chips as well? That was Karen Lewis.
Okay, so 3 bits of that. So yes, if you've got the space, then piling it up, and you don't even need to turn it. You could just pile it and leave it for 12 months and then use it. What you'll probably find is there's bits of that heap that haven't quite broken down as well, but it's perfectly fine. So because turning it is quite a lot of effort. But yeah, either just stacked or stacked and turn is fine. You can just put it into sacks. I would say black bin liners is fine. What I would say is even better, if you can get them, are those big 1-ton bags that builders use
big bag
for sand. Yeah, bigger word than what they call them, but those big are really bag. Good. Because you ideally you want it open rather than sealed. It will break down if it's sealed, but the risk is it keeps too dry if you have it in a bag that isn't open. So those builders bags are really good. And then, so what was the third bit? The biochar, is that biocoal, biochar, is that the same thing?
Biocarbon, I don't, bicarb. Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I've done a few bits of trials with biochar, and I think there is some real potential to use it. And yes, you can add it in with woodchip or with compost. I think from my experience, it has the biggest benefit on very light sandy soils or in tunnels where you get real extremes of temperature and moisture. So biochar does a really good job of holding on to nutrients and moisture and protecting soil organisms from being harmed. So in these very dry or extreme conditions, biochar can be really good. It's also it can be really good in propagation composts, and definitely in sort of pots and hanging baskets and things, works really well. I would say if you've got quite a rich clay soil, I don't think biochar is going to do much. From my experience, I mean, it probably won't do any harm, but I don't think you'll get a lot of benefit. Right. And you do have to be careful, depending on where you're getting the biochar from. You do have to get it. You have to make sure that it's not fresh. So, you know, when I talked about wood chips sucking up nitrogen, biochar does that times 100. It's like this big sponge, and if it's fresh, it's effectively a sponge that needs feeding. So it'll suck up all the nutrients and moisture from around it. So a lot of commercial biochar products now will have added worm casts or seaweed liquid into them. So they sort of pre-charge them, they call them. Yeah. But what you can do, you can put it into your compost heap, and then over the course of the 6 months, it will effectively do that job for you. But don't put it fresh, basically, into the soil.
Actually, in our allotment federations, we have this very circular system, as we don't have any toilets. We call it golden water. Do you, do you use it as well? Yeah, that's very rich of nitrogen.
Yeah, so that would be perfect to mix with biochar. Absolutely. Yeah, no, that'd be really good.
And then Ulrika asked, could you repeat what the farmer did to keep the heat down, not to kill the plants in his
Okay, yes. So this plastic that he's holding, the perspex, can you see that in the picture?
Yeah.
So that's what is it? I don't know, a centimetre thick, maybe half a centimetre thick. So it's double. It's one of these ones that's sort of got air in the middle, and it just provides a bit of insulation. That it's still warm enough, and as you can see, he covers it as well, so he's got hoops to keep the heat in, but it just means that the roots of the plant weren't on the really hot bit of the wood chip.
Okay. And how small pieces was it was let through in the sieving?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's for the propagation compost. Yes. So well, pretty small, yeah. So you want it to look like, almost like peat, I guess, in that sense. So you don't want any big lumps of wood, but a fairly, garden sieve with relatively small holes will be fine. I mean, it's quite straightforward to do. I mean, Ian Tolhurst has a he has like it looks a bit like a washing machine because he's doing a bigger volume, but you can do it just with a handheld sieve and it works fine.
Okay, and what's the minimum volume for a hotbed like this?
Well, you could I think you could do it in 1 pallet cubed, so sort of 1 meter cubed would probably work. But obviously it's a bit cooler at the edges, so yeah.
Okay. Well, you can go on and save some questions.
That's fine, right? So this is this ramial chipwood that we've talked about a little bit already. There's so speaking in a way about people that have inspired me a bit in wood chip. There's a researcher two researchers, Sally Westaway and Joe Smith, who work for the Organic Research Centre in the UK, and they did a project looking at ramial wood. And there was a big study in Canada in the 1980s, and then nothing until 5 years ago when Sally and Joe looked at this. So they did a trial. So this picture is showing how much you put on. So it's showing the distribution rate. So it's basically just cut, chipped and spread. So there's no composting, no treatment, no additions. You literally just cut it and spread it. And because it's got these higher levels of nitrogen and other nutrients and enzymes and things that I mentioned, it seems as though it doesn't have any detrimental effect on the soil. So there were 3 trialists. One put it onto the green manure, the fertility building phase of his rotation. One put it onto bare soil before a wheat crop, and one incorporated it into their agroforestry system, I think the autumn before, and then incorporated it. So the 3 different systems, and none of them had any ill effects. And there is evidence that it does benefit soil. You sometimes get a bit of a reduction in year 1, it seems, and then increased production years 2, 3, and 4. And the great thing about it is you don't have to handle it 3 times. You don't have to stack it and compost it and turn it and then spread it. You can literally just get it and spread it. So it's potentially quite interesting from that point of view. But this is the bit where I was saying, if you're pruning if you're pruning your apple tree or your soft fruit bushes, actually just cutting them up and leaving them on the soil. Don't take them away, just leave them on top of the soil, and the worms and the organisms will do the rest.
Music for our ears. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Right, I'm getting towards the end. So I imagine that quite a few of you are practicing no-dig or interested in no-dig systems.
Yes.
And the good news is Woodchip works in no-dig. This is a grower in Scotland who, as you can see, was spreading. This is ramial woodchip again. I don't know if you can see, it's quite green almost. You can see how green it is. He's spreading it in the winter. There's snow everywhere. And he's then going to plant into it the following spring. So I think that's pushing it to the risky end of risky, in the sense that I would tend to use composted woodchip in no-dig systems. I think it reduces the risk. I think, although he's done it in the winter, so hopefully any problems will have, or any problems, the wrong word, any risk of soil imbalance and nutrient imbalance will have sorted themselves out. But I would tend to use composted woodchip, but I think that worked for him. And the only other thing, which is actually typical of a lot of no-dig systems, is just being careful about the risk of nutrient imbalance. So woodchip is quite high in potassium and phosphates, and if you keep adding it year in, year out, you can end up with quite high levels potentially that might then lock up other nutrients. So to just being aware of that, if you start seeing some problems, it might be worth just doing a soil test and seeing what your levels are. But equally, someone like Charles Dowding, who's the no-dig guru, he hasn't seen problems like that. So again, it's one of those areas that is debated, but it's worth keeping an eye on. But yeah, it's a clean, particularly if you haven't left it for ages at the end to get weedy, it's quite a clean material. So you're not bringing in lots of weed in the way that sometimes you can when you use compost for no-dig systems. So yeah, potentially really useful. Okay, so where you can get woodchip. Now, obviously, I don't know where you can get it in Sweden, and so you may tell me I'm talking rubbish when it comes to Sweden. But anyway, I'll tell you where sort of the typical outlets. So there are people in the UK anyway selling it in bags like that, and in the UK that costs about £10 a bag. I don't know what the exchange rate is.
Yeah, about 11, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's pretty expensive, but it's probably quite good material. Then there are quite a lot of people in the UK selling them in these 1-ton bags that we mentioned, and again they sort of range in the UK from maybe £60 a bag up to 150. I've seen people charging, which again feels quite expensive. Then in the UK, there's a website called ArbTalk, which is basically tree surgeons, and you can register yourself as a site for dropping tree surgeons. So if there isn't one in Sweden already, it'd be worth talking to your tree surgeon association and seeing if they could set one up. It works really well. So yeah, but definitely get in touch with tree surgeons, and certainly. Sorry, my dog started barking.
Oh, we don't hear it.
You don't hear it. That's fine. Okay, just distracted me. But yes, tree surgeons are a really good source. So mostly they produce more than they want or can deal with, and it's certainly in the UK they have to pay to dump it. So if they can find somewhere free to dump it, it works really well. So we're working at the farm with 2 tree surgeons. We're on their way home. We've got a nice concrete pad for them to dump on. We get free wood chip. They get somewhere to dump it, and it works well. And it's mostly good quality.
We have a collaboration. Some of our smaller associations or in the allotment world, they have treaties with the community that delivers leaves. Great. And why not start delivering wood chips? We will talk a bit about that campaign after.
Yeah, and then the other thing potentially for where you've got space is actually to bring wood to be chipped. So you could bring your own, although ideally you want to use it in the garden, but if you have a tree taken down and you can't use all the chip, bring it to a community wood chip, and then every 6 months you hire in a big wood chipper and chip it.
And that's the question. We have tried it, many of us, to hire one because you need a quite big one that is strong enough. But Lena asks, what is the price for a usable mulch machine for wood chips, like in England? And
how long is a piece of string? It depends on what you want. So you can pay £100 for something up to £100,000. I would typically not buy one. I would always recommend hiring one, because you can hire a much more powerful one, and it will do the job in an hour. Whereas otherwise you're spending all day feeding branches in. But yeah, I mean, it does depend a lot on where you are. I know there's parts of Scotland, for instance, where you can't hire one because there's nobody within 100 miles that hires chippers. So I think I imagine it will vary depending on sort of where you are. And
and we always try to do that many on the same time. And then I have this question: when, spring or fall or summer, when is the best time? I imagine it's not too wet would be good, or what do you say?
I mean, I think in terms of a product, it doesn't really matter. No. So if you do it in spring or summer, it will have more nutrients or more nitrogen, because you've got the leafy bit. Whereas obviously in the autumn and winter, the leaves have dropped and it sort of sucks it back in. Often, it's a question of when you can get on the ground. As you say, is it too wet to cut? There are some things. So the willow experiment that I mentioned, the timing there is quite crucial. So you need to cut the willow after the sap has started to rise, because that's when the salicylic acid comes into the branches, and then you need to chip it and use it within 2 weeks, because the salicylic acid is very soluble, and so the rain will wash it out of the chip. So if you leave it too long, your material's not in there. So there are some times when you might want to use it when the timing is crucial, but mostly I think it doesn't matter, is the short answer.
Okay. So
okay, and then the other bit is power companies that trim along their lines and sometimes have quite a lot to get rid of if you happen to be near one of those. That seems to be more in America, but there is a bit in the UK certainly. Or you can grow your own if you've got the space, and then you're in control again. So this is a place called Wakelands. It's a pioneering agroforestry system here in the UK, and they have, in this instance, they've got these double rows of hazel, and they coppice 1 row every year and wood chip it. And some of that they use for soil health and some for the biomass boiler. So there's and there's willow, poplar, chestnut, lots of things you can coppice and have a sustainable source of wood chip. And you can do that on an allotment scale. You just might only have 1 or 2 trees. You don't have to have a big long row. So
and we have some common spaces also.
So that's it. That's the end.
It's the end.
And that is a picture of composted wood chip. So that's, I mean, if you sieved it, you'd have those long bits taken out, but otherwise that's effectively what you're looking for.
Wow. And that's after a year or?
That's after 18 months, that one.
18 months.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, I have a few questions for you. And
I will leave that up because there's some links there.
There's some links, great.
So there's a link to Chelsea Green, which is the publisher of the Woodchip Handbook. There's a link to my website. There's a link to the Facebook group that I run called Woodchip for Soil Health. There is also actually another Facebook group called Ramiel Woodchip, which is run from a chap in America that's really good as well. And then
please, everyone, take a picture of this one.
I'm happy to send the presentation to you afterwards if that's useful as well. But
yeah, well, we will have it on recording also on our website for a while. So now we will have the pleasure of watching you in full screen for a while, and I will continue the questions. So I start from the bottom now and see how much we will have time for. If I use fresh like willow, salix or liguster, is there a risk that the chips will root?
I would say very, very tiny risk. I've never seen it.
It's not park slide.
No, I think it dries out too much and they're too small. So I mean, potentially there is a risk, but I've never seen it.
No. Great. Would you say it's better to spread a ready-made compost with mixed in wood chip in the beds while growing vegetables? Not only wood chips, a mix.
So.
But what that you said before, you shouldn't mix it too much, right?
So it's the question: should you add compost to the wood chip? Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think. So wood chip is only giving a certain set of nutrients. You know, it's not. I think mostly I wouldn't use wood chip as a nutrient source. I would use it as a soil health builder. So adding compost in, which will have other things in it, I think is usually a good thing for vegetables, because vegetables are quite heavy feeders. I think usually in a vegetable situation, if I've got compost, I'll add it as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things you can do if you're worried, for instance, about being a lot of weed seed in your compost, you can put a bit of compost and then put the wood chip on top of it, so you've got a cleaner surface.
Yeah. And then a couple of questions, and then I will tell a bit about the campaign we mentioned. Does the shipping wood emit CO2, or does it in fact store carbon?
Well, I think it does both. So yes, it definitely obviously does release CO2 as it rots down. Again, I looked for evidence when I was writing the book. I looked for evidence about this, because the other question I sometimes get asked about, you use lots of energy to run a wood chipper, and then, is it really carbon neutral? And the short answer is I don't know. So it will release CO2 as it breaks down, but it also does build soil carbon. So a proportion of that wood chip will then enter the soil carbon cycle and be held in the soil for longer. It's not permanent, but what seems to happen is it lasts for longer than, say, a green compost. So I think you may be locking it up for 3 or 4 years within the soil. So it'll slow that cycle down, and more of the carbon will be in the soil than it would have been if you hadn't used it. But then also, so one of the things I always think about, we talked about that holistic system. The wood chip doesn't exist on its own. So in that picture with the hazel and the chickens. So he's getting wood chip, but he's also providing shelter for his chickens. So the chickens are more productive and happier. So that's reduced carbon. He's also getting shelter from growing the trees for his crop. So that crop is more productive. So there's all of these potential carbon benefits happening from a system that's integrated and planned in that way. And that, in a way, that's how I think about it. And yes, yes, it is using carbon to run a chipper, and yes, some carbon is lost. But what would happen otherwise? And with the tree surgeons, for instance, before, if they're not going to chip it, what would they do? Well, they'd burn it, and then it's all lost. So at least this way, we're getting a benefit of increased soil and health production, so plant production and all of that stuff. So I think it's not perfect, but I definitely think the overall benefit is there, I would say. But.
Yeah. And I just heard from Katja in Pungpinan, one of our very nice allotment federations. We have a deal with arborists, the tree surgeons in their right. association as well. So it's coming. Right. I put a link, Rika helped me with a link on the Q&A med den här kampanjen Halvera torven som ni har i den här. Det är Stockholms koloniträdgårdar som sedan drygt ett år jobbar på det. Att visa hur man kan skapa en bra jord. Så att gå gärna in i den här Q&A och spara den länken. Eller så söker ni på Stockholms koloniträdgårdar. I would like to thank you very much for spending a night with us in Sweden. And perhaps elsewhere, there might be people from all around the world. We don't know that yet. I didn't ask. And it was so nice to hear this. So many good news. So many new things to learn. And that's, as I started off with, the best thing about being a cultivate is all you can learn and the benefits from learning. So thank you very much, Ben Raskin. And we will look you up. Jag säger också jättestort tack från Koloniträdgårdsförbundet